Welcome to Brad Explains the Law. Today I'm going to explain corporations and why they are the foundation that supports our commercial and economic system. But first, a message from this guy. Sorry for the interruption, but it's important that I tell you that this video is not legal advice. It's only general information and opinion of Brad Hamilton. If you need legal advice, you should contact a lawyer who can advise you on your specific facts and issues. Also, this video doesn't create a lawyer-client relationship between you and me or my law firm. In other words, I'm not your lawyer unless we sign an engagement agreement. Now, back to the program. Welcome back. Before I explain what a corporation is, let's think about what a corporation can do. A corporation isn't human, but it can do some human things. A corporation can be a party to a contract, it can make things, buy things, sell things, it can own property, it can make money, it can even commit and be convicted of crimes. But at least until Skynet becomes self-aware, corporations can only take these actions through humans acting on the corporation's behalf. So how is it that a corporation, which is really just an idea or a human construct, has the power to do human things? To understand that, let's look back in time a little bit. Corporations as we now know them are actually quite recent in human history. For most of human history, only individuals could conduct business. And this carried a great deal of risk because if you had a business and you lost everything, you lost everything. And if you couldn't pay your debts, in addition to losing everything, you might go to debtor's prison, or you might have to work off your debt as a slave or an indentured servant. So talk about discouraging innovation. Every business decision was something like, hey, let's buy a boat and haul grain. And then, oh, wait a minute, if the boat sinks, I can't pay back the loan for the boat and I can't pay for the grain. So I'm going to be working for these guys the rest of my life. Definitely discouraged innovation. And this is the way things worked through most of human history. So really the only people or organizations who could conduct business on a large scale were governments, people with power, monarchs, people who had an army who could protect them if they owed money. This started to change around the year 1000. Trade between the Italian city-states and the Muslim world to the east was booming. Silk, spices, tea, things like that. And in fact, it was so big that the city-states in Italy, Venice, Pisa, Genoa, were at war with one another. They would sink each other's ships to try to corner the market or get a bigger portion of the trade coming from the east. It'd be kind of like Denver and Cheyenne going to war over cattle and grain or something like that. But war is very expensive. And the city-states were having trouble financing both war and trade. And somebody came up with the idea that you would be able to, or they would be able to, encourage investment from wealthy merchants and wealthy landowners if they provided those landowners with limited liability. And so wealthy individuals, wealthy estates could invest in a ship or a group of ships to conduct trade, to go off to the east and buy goods and bring it back. But their liability, if the ship was sunk or stolen, their liability was limited to the amount of money that they had invested into the enterprise. And that was sort of the initiation of limited liability. And it didn't expand very much for a few thousand years. It sort of went on like that for a while until the 1600s when England came up with the idea of a joint stock company. So what was going on with England at that time? Well, England was at war with Spain, both physically and trade war. Spain and Portugal had taken over the world of commerce and sort of cornered the market and the high seas in trade, particularly in Mexico and that we now know as Latin America and South America, and also trade from the east to some extent. And England, being an island, and being more isolated was at a disadvantage in trade. They had to rule the high seas, and doing that, fighting a war, both a trade war and a physical war against Spain, was extremely expensive. So we're starting to see a theme here, a common theme: war, trade, power. And so, in order to invest money in trade while England was using the government funds to fight war, they adopted the joint stock company idea, which provided limited liability to investors while being able to aggregate great amounts of money in order to conduct the enterprise that the crown wanted them to conduct. And the way they did that was by granting monopolies. So joint stock companies could only be authorized by an act of the monarchy, the king or the queen, who would grant a charter to a joint stock company, to a group of people who could then pool their funds for a joint enterprise and would be granted limited liability. So the extent of their risk and their loss could only go up to the amount of money that they invested in the enterprise. Some of these companies became almost pseudo governments in themselves. The most famous one being the East India Company. There was also the Virginia Company. There was also the Spanish Company, the Eastland Company, the Russia Company, the Turkey Company, and the Levant Company. And so Queen Elizabeth would grant these companies monopolies in specific geographic regions of the world to conduct trade in return for investment and limited liability. Of course, the East India Company is the most famous. The East India Company, even though the Virginia Company was established to take on the Americas, the East India Company grew so big that it became almost a government by itself, and it got into big trouble economically, essentially fighting wars as a private company, particularly in India and the Middle East. And in fact, the East India Company may have been the first enterprise that was deemed by the government to be too big to fail. And so when the East India Company started to fail economically, the government of England decided they would give them a bailout. And the way they were going to finance that bailout, well, there were actually many ways. They were going to impose taxes in a variety of areas. But one of the taxes they decided to impose was a tax on tea, and in particularly tea going to the Americas. So it was actually the bailout of the East India Company that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the Declaration of Independence and the formation of the United States as an independent government. Little known fact, maybe? I don't know. So these joint stock companies, granted by specific, and there weren't very many of them, granted by specific government charter, were for the purpose of trade: gold, spices, silk, opium, and slaves. Slaves were a big part of the trade of the East India Company and other companies, the Italian city-states, but particularly the Dutch, the Spanish, during this time, the 1600s, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the English. And so these joint stock companies with limited liability were authorized by the government in order to expand the government's reach into these areas of trade throughout the world. So when the United States was formed, as the colonies were formed, they adopted a similar procedure whereby the colonial government could grant charters to people to form joint stock companies. These were very limited. There weren't very many of them, and mostly they were done for public works, for building dams and fortifications and things like that, as the fledgling United States, at that time the colonies, began to grow and need some infrastructure. It wasn't until truly the late 1800s, almost into 1900, before states enacted laws that allowed people to form corporations without a direct charter from either the state, before that, the colonial government, then the state government after the United States was formed. And so we're in 2020. So 120 years ago, roughly, a little bit more because they started to come into place in the late 1800s, but only 120 years ago did the first laws come into place that allowed private individuals to form corporations without a government charter and the government involvement in what the power of that corporation was. That means in the life of my grandparents, there was no such thing as a corporation like we know it today. Since that time, corporations have been authorized by state law. So each state has its own corporate law, although there are differences among the states, but for the most part, the laws have a lot of standard features. So every state has a corporation law. Every state allows people to form corporations. And the shareholders under those corporations, under state law, have limited liability so long as they comply with the requirements to maintain limited liability. So corporations as we know them now are a very recent thing in the course of human history. So the reason that I said that corporations are the foundation of our commerce and economic system is because of limited liability, so that shareholders and investors in corporations are not liable for the losses of the corporation or the damages it does, the damage it does to other people, other corporations, any liabilities it accrues are limited to the investment that the shareholders put into the corporation. And that feature is the key to opening up commerce and encouraging investment and innovation in high-risk enterprises. If a person has funds that they're willing to invest, some of those funds are occasionally going to be dedicated to very high-risk enterprises where the reward could be great, but the loss would be limited to the funds invested. And that's what drives innovation and progress in economic systems. So corporations as we know them now are created under state law. There are no federal corporations in the United States, although Canada has a Federal Corporations Act. And if you're forming a corporation in Canada, you can do it either as a provincial corporation or as a federal corporation. Now, there are still, and have been since the inception in the United States, certain federal charters for organizations, types of corporations. So, for example, most national banks are what's called a national association. That's a banking corporation formed under charter granted by the United States of America under various banking laws. Certain public works enterprises will be chartered under federal law as well. But the corporations that conduct private businesses, we know them, other than financial institutions, are formed under state law. And every state act is a little bit different. And in a future presentation, I'm going to discuss and explain why Delaware is such a popular forum for forming corporations. But that's beyond the scope of this particular presentation. So in order to form a corporation, you have to pick the state where you're going to form it, and then you form it under that law. Typically, you do so by filing articles of incorporation or a certificate of corporation. The names vary by state, but the most common designation is articles of incorporation, and with the Secretary of State or whatever state government division is charged with forming corporations. You file that, and that forms your corporation. So the hierarchy of corporations is shareholders, directors, and officers. For that, I'm going to go to the whiteboard. The hierarchy of authority for a corporation starts with the shareholders. Shareholders, however, have limited authority. They, most importantly, have the power to elect the board of directors. Beyond that, Shareholders typically only have the right to vote on things that are specifically reserved to them by statute or by agreement with the company, between the shareholders and the company. However, the shareholders do have the power to elect the board of directors. So if the board of directors doesn't do what the shareholders want them to do, if a shareholder or multiple shareholders have a control position, they can simply replace the board of directors with directors who do what the shareholders want them to do. The board of directors has the statutory obligation and the authority to manage the corporation. They're elected by the shareholders. The board of directors has the bigger picture obligations for corporate strategy, corporate direction, managing the direction of the business of the corporation. The board appoints officers to run the day-to-day operations of the corporation. And the officers have the obligation to run the day-to-day operations of the corporation. The board of directors owes fiduciary duties to, nope, not the shareholders, the corporation. The officers also owe fiduciary duties to the corporation. People often confuse that and think that the board of directors and the officers owe fiduciary duties to the shareholders, but that's not correct. Both the statutes and the common law state that the board of directors owe fiduciary duties to the corporation, and the only way the shareholders can enforce those fiduciary duties is on behalf of the corporation in most circumstances. That's a generalization. In the future, I will do a presentation explaining what fiduciary duties are in the context of a corporation. So a corporation is a legal person authorized by state law, enacted by state legislatures, which grant people the power to form a corporation that has limited liability for its shareholders and the power to act as a human being in entering contracts, taking on debt, buying things, selling things, and essentially conducting business. Of course, artificial intelligence has not progressed far enough yet for corporations to do these things on their own, so they need human beings. The human beings who act on behalf of the corporation are the board of directors and the officers. The board of directors appoints and controls the officers. The shareholders elect the board of directors, with the key feature of a corporation being limited liability for its shareholders who are its investors. That limited liability is the key feature that allows investors to spread their investment over a broad array of enterprises and helps drive innovation and progress in our economic system. Thanks for watching Brad Explains the Law. My next video will explain what a limited liability company is and how it's different from a corporation. So subscribe below if you want to be the first person to see it. If you'd like me to explain a business law topic of interest to you, you can email me at lawofbiz, B-I-Z, or Z, @gmail.com. See you next time.